So, welcome back to Boldly Launched Upon the Deep. In case you're following along in your program, we are actually skipping the entr'acte, and we're going to go straight to the next piece on the program. So, this is Alan McSweeney. I'm Douglas Dietrich, and in case you forgot, this is the band, Anyone Ensemble. And in Act 1 of the show, we took a close look at some of the characters in Moby Dick, kind of reimagining them and wondering what they might say if they were alive today and able to talk to us. And in Act 2, we're going to nerd out on some of the ideas in Moby Dick, some of the big picture thinking that makes Melville and this book still relevant to today's audiences.
Our next piece is a piece of fiction written by Doug, and it was inspired by a particularly fascinating chapter from Moby Dick called The Chart.
When you first read this chapter, you think it's just another one of these tangents. And in some ways it is, but what happens in the chapter is so fascinating when you think about the way things have changed today. So Captain Ahab is down in his cabin. He's all alone, and he has all his charts, his maps of the ocean all spread out on his table. And he's drawing lines, and he's looking back into his ship logs as far back as he can, and he's looking for all the times that anyone ever told him anything that they had seen Moby Dick or heard anything about him. Where did it happen? When did it happen? And he wants to see, is there any way that I can use that information to find Moby Dick? And the way he does this, it almost makes me feel like he could see the future.
Could see the future.
That's right. So it's almost like the 19th century nautical equivalent of big data.
Right. I mean, it would be a very different story if, Captain Ahab had GPS and a database stored in the cloud somewhere.
Absolutely. In the cloud. That's the key phrase. So in this story, I imagined a source of data that was quite literally in the cloud. This is a story about birds, a pigeon that can talk, and a man who sets out to talk to him and to teach him a new word. John stood on the sidewalk with a lump of bread in his mouth. He spit the moist ball into his fingers and held it just inches from his lips. Seconds later, a pigeon landed on his hand and pecked at the bread. He recognized this bird from the brown streaks on its head as the one he had been feeding for years now. As it ate, he spoke to it in the coos, hums, and grunts of its own language. They talked about what pigeons talk about. Where good food can be gotten, where the best stones for the gizzard are, and the best ledges to build a nest. But today was different. John wanted to teach the pigeon a new word. John gently shook the bird off of his hand. It landed on the sidewalk and watched him. Then John flapped his arms and took jumping steps around in a circle. "Fly," the pigeon cooed. "Fly," John repeated, and he nodded. The pigeon bobbed his head. John flapped his arms as he moved toward the pigeon, and as he came close, he crouched down and offered the bread, saying a word he had practiced saying many times as he lay in his bed at night, and the pigeon lay somewhere else in its nest. It was a new word made out of the words for fly and feed that he had combined into one. John repeated this pantomime 7 times, and the bird just watched until it burst into flight, leaving him alone on the street. A few minutes later, the bird flew back, landed in John's left hand, and dropped a dry, dusty breadcrumb in his right. Nothing like this had ever happened to the pigeons before. All of them learned this one word, and soon they made up many more. When they gathered together on street corners, they passed their new language to each other as if it was a newborn child. And like a child, they fed it, and it grew. Whenever two birds came together, they passed to each other all the new names they had learned. In this way, they made a map of the city, filled not just with physical features, but all the people, too, each one with a name like an address, a horoscope, a prognosis, and a birth certificate, all woven together like twigs in a nest.
We've a net the size of our whole city and lay it end to end. A net of living beings you have taught, but are they foes or friends? You can't leave it alone, can you? You can't leave it alone, can you?
Carrie sat at the table in the kitchen in the apartment next to John's. She could see people walking down on the sidewalk outside, all of them in a hurry. They had to walk around that same man who was standing there like he did every morning, with a pigeon eating out of his hands. She knew he was her neighbor, but she didn't know his name. Earlier that morning, she had gone down to get her mail, and he walked through the lobby to his usual spot. She pretended to open her mail as he walked by, though it was hardly necessary. He didn't even look at her. Her kettle whistled, and she turned back to her stove. There was a clean mug in the dish rack, but the tea bags weren't where she thought they were. She looked through her cupboards, found instant coffee, and added that to hot water in the mug. When she turned back to the table, she saw a pigeon standing on the ledge outside her window, watching her. It was just a bird, just a pigeon, but she recognized it as his bird from the brown streaks on its head. It startled her, and she jumped, spilling the coffee onto the table. The coffee stained a stack of envelopes brown, and in that moment she thought ahead to when the paper would be dry. It would be wrinkled, but intact, the writing still legible, and she'd still have to open them. The pigeon came back to John, landing again in his hands. The bread was gone now, but rather than asking for more, it just started talking. It spoke so quickly that John couldn't understand anything at all, but soon he began to recognize a few words.
Woman.
Building. Brown. Water.
But they didn't mean anything to him. The bird strung together more and more words.
Yellow sweatshirt.
Third floor. Big curly hair. Black shorts.
And John began to recognize that the bird was describing his neighbor. He didn't know her name, but he had seen her in the lobby wearing those clothes, clutching envelopes from her mailbox, and her hair was unmistakable. The bird went on.
Brown water on the stove.
Frightened woman with big curly hair.
Shrieking kettle on the stove.
And John began to feel a creeping heat in his stomach that was moving out to his whole body. A sick, buzzing sensation filled him. It reminded him of the first time he'd ever felt shame and how it fascinated and haunted him. He didn't know exactly what he knew, but he knew he wasn't supposed to know it. He was still standing on the sidewalk with people walking around him, but in his imagination he was looking at the city from high in the air, as if from a perch on the ledge of a building. There were so many windows.
Were you getting lonely on your corner with only sand and sea? It's innocent enough to need companions who seem so wild and free. You can't leave it alone, can you? You can't leave it alone, can you?
Your bird was just at my window. It scared me, Carrie said. She'd come down onto the street, angry and needing to vent. "I'm sorry, I didn't ask him to do that," John said. To Carrie, it looked like he really meant it, as crazy as it was. All the anger she felt was gone now, and all the bad feelings she'd had about him since she moved into the building were gone now, too. Turns out he's just a weird man with a bird. She smiled. "What would he tell me about you, if he could talk? The bird, I mean. If the bird could talk," Carrie said. "He wants to do the right thing, but he doesn't know how," John said. "The right thing," Carrie said? "How about next time you tell him to bring me a lottery ticket? A winner, okay?"